Of course I think we can win, and I'm fighting every single day to win.
We've now put forward a plan that... Is that bird worrying you?
Yeah. They're afraid of us. They can see that our movement is growing.
Well, you're not going to have a stand in the Parliament.
Let there be 1,000 lessons learned as far as I'm concerned.
This is the 4ZZZ Break the Election podcast for the Queensland state election in 2024. Hello, and welcome to the 4ZZZ Breaks the Election podcast, just 24 days away from the 2024 Queensland state election. My name is Alexis Pink, I'm the news coordinator at 4ZZZ, and joining us today are...
My name is Mack.
My name is Tasmia.
I'm Jasmine.
And these are all of the wonderful people in our newsroom today. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here. Thanks for the invite.
In this podcast series, we'll be bringing you up to date on the election and breaking down on what is being said on the campaign trail. Let's start at the top. Tasmania, what have you got for us?
Billboards featuring Queensland MPs ahead of this month's state election are being funded by the taxpayers' purse. According to an analysis of spending by MPs conducted by the ABC, the billboards were paid for out of the allocated communications budget for each MP. In order to meet legal requirements, the billboards do not reference political parties or ask people to vote a certain way. However, they still state campaign promises and display images of the election candidates. Government and opposition MPs are both involved in making these claims. At present, there is no plan to reduce or change communications spending allowances allocated to Queensland political parties.
Certainly an interesting story, and early in the campaign as well. So what are your initial thoughts on this? How do you feel about this particular action by MPs?
Well, it doesn't seem like too much of a surprise that incumbent politicians are using taxpayer-funded communications budgets to be able to put these things out, because how else would they have done that? But what's interesting here is that they're doing it by stealth. They're not releasing any figures necessarily, which seems all the more strange.
Well, they will have to eventually. The communication budgets are, of course, logged. They have to be presented to Parliament at some point or another. But, yeah, it is a little bit, let's say, shady. And when they say they're not showing political signage, it's a bit six of one, half dozen the other, because if you look at the Liberal billboards, they're all in blue, and all of the Labor billboards are in red, and those are colours traditionally associated with those things. They're supposed to evoke those thoughts in your head.
And people are political, like all of the people involved in government are political figureheads now.
Well, that's true. So it is a bit of a strange thing. So are we comfortable with the idea that the taxpayer is funding these sorts of billboards?
One would think, this being the communications budget, it's also sort of used more for, used in addition to being able to communicate with your electorate and being able to talk to the people that you're going to be representing. It seems a bit like a waste of money considering how expensive some of these billboards can be.
So maybe a change in the rules?
A little bit, yeah, maybe. A limit, cap, who knows?
I guess we'll see how we go. All right, let's move on to our second story. Jasmine.
Queensland Premier Stephen Miles and Queensland Labor has pledged to create a new publicly owned energy retailer if re-elected in order to provide more competition and choice in the market. The government claims that the retailer would help provide cheaper power prices for all Queenslanders and give regional Queenslanders a choice outside of Ergon, which services 97% of the state. In a statement, Miles said that in the southeast, the publicly owned retailer would go after the business of retailers who are paying too much with private retailers.
Yeah, so an interesting story and sort of an extension of the way that the Labor Party has been running recently on being more active in spaces where people are paying for services like 50-cent fares and regos, and even potentially creating a public petrol station service. So, yeah, how do we feel about this? Is this, the second coming of socialism?
Hard to deny that it is a net benefit for ratepayers.
Well, it could be, definitely. So, what are your thoughts currently on electricity? Do you feel like you're getting a good deal for the money that you're paying? Jasmine, how do you feel about electricity prices? Are they just too high?
Electricity is probably one of the biggest expenses, I think, for every household these
Probably
days.
Only rent would be higher, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So having a second retailer in there might actually impact prices. You could imagine that the LNP's response to this is going to be fairly swift based on their current trajectory. And they certainly have been talking about electricity prices for a while now, especially around Callide B and the explosion there. But there are also experts telling us that rebuilding Callide B may not stabilise power prices. So, yeah, it's a bit of a weird time.
Absolutely. Competition in the market's a good way to do that.
Yeah, there might be other ways of doing that. Maybe a full nationalisation might also be an approach, but certainly extra competition would be welcome in a market that's maybe not as easy to self-regulate as you'd think. All right, let's move on to another story. Mack, what have you got for us today?
The Premier and opposition leader have faced calls to tone down their rhetoric when talking about the electoral system in Queensland. Yesterday, LNP leader David Crisafulli called the compulsory preferential voting system undemocratic, while Labor leader Stephen Miles called Mr Crisafulli's proposed changes a corruption of the electoral system. University professor and former Labor MP John Mickle called for the parties to moderate their claims, saying that the system is something we should be proud of and should maintain confidence in it. The preference system in Queensland elections have changed several times since the 1990 reforms, with the Labor Party, Liberals and Nationals taking different positions on compulsory preferences and optional preferences over the years as their electoral interests changed, according to Professor Graham Orr.
Okay, so this is the sort of story I love. I love electoral systems. I can't help myself. It's just one of those things. So who can tell me the difference between optional preferential voting and compulsory preferential voting?
I think from my understanding, optional preferential voting is when you choose your top picks for the vote, and then I think that's all I know. I'm not too much.
That's okay. Let me expand out your thoughts on that. So optional preferential voting is where you have to number one box, your first preference candidate, and then as many boxes as you like afterwards. So you can just leave it at one, or you could number all the boxes, or only a few of the boxes. In compulsory preferential voting, all of the boxes on the paper you have to number from 1 to whatever the largest number is for that particular electorate. So if there's 6, you have to number all 6 boxes. So there are definitely different thoughts on these particular systems. Certainly, optional preferential voting is a much more free system when it comes to ranking your own choices, because you may not want to give preferences to effectively choices that you would consider interchangeable. Say you were particularly left-wing, for example, you may not want to give all of your preferences to Conservative parties. And equally the same way for Conservatives, you may not want to give a preference to left-wing parties. Compulsory preferential voting does have a specific advantage, and that's why we're talking about this. Why would the Labor Party itself want compulsory preferential voting?
Because they receive a lot of votes from Greens voters who place Greens above Labor, and after Greens aren't successful in forming government, they will go down and be received by Labor and help bolster their votes.
And that's pretty much it. Under optional preferential voting, a Greens vote, just vote one, wouldn't flow to the Labor Party naturally. You have to put a preference in place. And if it's compulsory preferences, you may be more inclined to put the Greens there than, say, another party from the right.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it would blunt Labor's electoral chances.
One thing else I found quite interesting is that, of course, it's Crisafulli, the leader of Queensland's Labor and National Party, saying that he wants this to happen to help break up the power that Greens and Labor do have collectively, despite the fact that his party is made up of 2 parties, the Liberals and the Nationals, who formed a group together and functionally receive votes from 2 separate, now together, parties.
All right, so that's all the time that we've got for this episode of Break the Election podcast. For more updates, you can find us on 4ZZZ in the morning bulletins, Brisbane Line on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at midday, and make sure to catch the Pineapple Rebellion at 9am on Friday. If you want to support the project, please subscribe to 4ZZZ. You can go to 4ZZZ.org.au/support and subscribe today. Thanks for joining us today, and we will be back tomorrow. Goodbye!
See ya! Bye.